So friends, colleagues, let's start to the second session of exciting panel. So this panel is a deeper dive of ICS and ComFrame. Paolo mentioned a little bit introduction part of the ICS. So this is a more deeper dive. I'm just to remember what Vicky said at the beginning of today. She said this building or this site was a very old traditional Catholic boarding school. So assuming that all of us are very promising future global leader taught, let's say a few centuries ago, how we are taught? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure we are taught not only lecture, but dialogue, discussion. So this session is very much dialogue, discussion between our members and the stakeholders. So that's more interaction. And that's critically important part of our session, discussion together. And I don't need any introduction to the chair or the moderator, Vicky Saporta, our leader and the host of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yoshi. So in the first panel, you got quite a bit of information. It was more briefing, really, and it got less interactive on what we have delivered so far. So we are trying ComFrame, as Paolo said, is the set of qualitative requirements and quantitative requirements that apply to internationally active insurance groups. In March, we launched a consultation on an integrated package of ComFrame, and you got briefing on the individual ICPs we consulted on and the ComFrame element of the ICPs a little bit earlier. And also, we set out your feedback that we are in train to adopt. And then on the quantitative element of ComFrame, the ICS, as Paolo said, yesterday the Executive Committee adopted the ICS version 1.0 for extended field testing and public release to all the public. Clearly, to a number of participants and stakeholders in this room, the technical content of this paper will be well known because a number of you, but not all of you, are volunteers to the field testing exercise, and that you would have received it in May. But yesterday's decision is an important decision for our organization because it reaches a milestone. And from then onwards, we need to deliver ICS version 2.0. So this panel is going to look at towards adoption of ComFrame, which includes, as I said, qualitative and quantitative elements. So with that, let me introduce you to our panelists, our distinguished panelists. On my left, I've got Hugh Francis, who is Director of External Reporting Developments in Aviva. Then next to him, I have Toshi Sumino, who is Executive Officer, Chief of Corporate Planning Unit in Daiichi Life Holdings. Then immediately next to me, I've got Martin Hansen, who is Managing Director for Regulatory Policy in AIG. And on my right, in the couch, ready to be psychoanalyzed by you and them. I will just moderate. I've got Katie Wade, who's a member of the Executive Committee of the IAIS and a Commissioner for Connecticut, and Frank Grund, member of the Executive Committee of the IAIS and also responsible for insurance supervision in BaFin in Germany. So with that, how are we going to structure the panel? It's going to be in three parts. The first part, I'm going to ask some questions to the gentleman on my left. and then some questions to Frank and Katie. And then I will leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience. On the second part, I'll do something similar, but with a different set of questions. And again, I will leave some time for questions from the audience. And the third part will be just questions to us from the audience. So let's start. The first part, the broad topic, is ComFrame as a comprehensive framework consisting of qualitative and quantitative elements and possible challenges in achieving our objectives. So first, Martin, what is your vision of how the IAIS should consider quantitative requirements, ICS mainly, versus qualitative requirements, and what are possible challenges in designing ComFrame in such a comprehensive way?
Thanks, Vicky. So I think first it's useful to start off at a high level about why we need both quantitative and qualitative standards as part of a group-wide supervisory framework. And on the quantitative dimension, and here, obviously within the context of ComFrame, we're talking about ICS, then there are really a number of different aspects of the utility of quantitative metrics. So I think first of all, there's value in having a consistent benchmark across insurers. And I think that's useful for supervisors in making comparisons across companies that operate in different jurisdictions. But it's also, I think, of value to all of us as firms competing in a global marketplace to help support a global market playing field where we're all judged according to a comparable standard. I think the second utility of a quantitative benchmark is as a communication tool. There's this analogy about ICS as a common language, but with different accents across jurisdictions. And I think that's a very powerful analogy, because I think that really speaks to what the utility of the ICS is, from my perspective, at least in its initial phase. I think that also implies that how you use the ICS is important. So I think at least in the initial phase, to look at the ICS as a specific point estimate and not really recognize the error band around it, I think would be a mistake. I think we really have to think about the ICS in broader brushstrokes, at least as it continues to mature. Thirdly is coherence. So especially for a consolidated measure like the ICS, there's value in looking at insurance and financial risks in an integrated, coherent way. And then I think finally is complexity. I think we have to acknowledge there's certain risks where you need to apply mathematical tools. Risks that have optionality to them, risks which are low frequency but high severity, looking at diversification across a group. Those are important areas to measure and quantify where words just won't suffice. You need a mathematical tool to do that. Having said all that, we clearly can't rely just on a quantitative metric. We can't design a perfect algorithm and set the system on autopilot and let it run. There's an important role of judgment as an overlay. In looking at risk management practices, we can't reduce that to a number either. That's something where it's fundamentally going to be a qualitative exercise to look at actuarial practices, enterprise risk management practices, investment management practices. And I think finally, we all have to acknowledge that no quantitative measure can fix every loophole or solve every problem, and there are always going to be a set of assumptions underlying a more risk-sensitive approach. So I think that it's important to have qualitative guardrails, so to speak, around the estimation of risk and the quantification of risk in order to provide credibility around it. I think that's something that's important for the credibility of the supervisory construct and the quantitative part of the construct. And it's also something that's in all of our collective interests. I think we want to be sure that we're all approaching the measure in a comparable way and that the system is not being gamed. And that absolutely has to tie back to qualitative standards. When we sort of look at, I think a natural question is, how is the quantitative and the qualitative sides, how are they integrated within ComFrame? And I think one current and very vivid example is around liability discounting. So if we look at what we view as the right quantitative way within a regulatory capital construct to value your liabilities, it's essential to recognize that as insurers, we take a liability-driven investment approach. So it's absolutely essential that the value of our liabilities reflects how we value the assets. That's fundamental to ALM. It's fundamental to how we manage the business. At the same time, that type of approach necessarily will entail some degree of internal assumptions. So I think it's important to have guardrails to ensure, again, credibility of those assumptions. And I think also from a broader perspective, for a evaluation approach that's anchored in ALM, it's important, I think a necessary condition then is that you have proper ALM structures in place. And that's, I think, where again, the qualitative side comes in to ensure that the ALM practices are robust enough to provide credibility and justification for using an own assets approach to liability discounting. So that's just one live example that we work with a lot.
Thank you, Martin. Before I ask another question, Toshi, Hugh, do you have anything to add to Martin's comments?
Yeah, I'd reinforce a couple of points from Martin. I think as we heard from the first session, there's a lot of work being done on ComFrame. For us, we think ComFrame is much more than just about the quantitative aspects. And so we think it's really important that the two are fully integrated, primarily because the important thing for the global groups that are subject to ComFrame, having a good and a really strong ERM is the best security for policyholders, for management, but also for regulators as well. So I think we've got very common goals in relation to what we're trying to achieve in the wider bit of ComFrame. I think also, you can't look at the two discrete, and actually, in fairness, we know the political challenges around ICS itself, so actually a parallel process that basically pushes on the ComFrame qualitative aspects is really important to make certain we deliver something achievable. And I think we can make probably a greater consensus and progress on that wider qualitative space without getting into the politics and the challenges on valuation on the quantitative bits. And so within that, you can develop some really incisive bits on the within the ICPs, and then but obviously within ComFrame around asset management, around investment principles, around Prudential person principles, which are actually very much about how we invest, how we're trying to cover our liabilities, how we protect policyholders, how we identify, measure and manage risk, how we invest to try and meet our liabilities. To me, that's always been the most important thing of a regulatory framework. The quantitative element is a bit of a byproduct of that. But I think also it's very important that we integrate and have a comprehensive framework. So, as an example, Marty mentioned about the own assets with guardrails. Well, clearly, we know that within the regulatory community, there is some discomfort about anything that's relying on companies. But actually, if you have an overall coherent framework, for example, investment principles or a Prudential person approach, you can have that assurance that actually the objective of any own asset is within a framework where we have principles in place that says our objective is to manage, monitor, invest appropriately to meet those to meet customer liabilities, and therefore you have an integrated approach that you're not relying on just the quantitative, but the two are integrated. And I think where there's concern about things like chasing yield, I think they can be firmly addressed by having principles in place within ComFrame that clearly said these are the objectives of your investment management procedures, and therefore that should disincentivize that, because actually we should be doing it because it's a sound way to manage our business.
Thank you, Hugh. Toshi?
Yes, let me add a comment to that. First of all, I'd like to declare that I'm supportive of ICS as well as ComFrame. Having said that, the issue is how and whether to strike the best balance between the two, quantitative and qualitative elements. To be sure, ICS is one of the most important elements in the ComFrame. I admit that. However, you cannot tell all the business or story of one company doing the business globally with a set of numbers elaborated by the ICS. Behind the numbers, there are so many various elements, including how the cash flow looks like, and what the risk profiles are, and there are so many assumptions as well. So it's really a judgmental, actually. In ICS itself, there are qualitative aspects in itself, so that it might be answer to this, the next question probably. But we have to be really careful about not let the investors or policyholders throughout the world to misunderstand this ICS. It's very easy to look at the numbers, but that's not the intention of IAIS or the industry players as well. So we have to be really careful on that.
Thank you very much, Toshi. Turning to my colleagues from ExCo, Katie, what is your view on these issues? What is your perspective as a supervisor in terms of the balance between quantitative and qualitative?
Sure. So the success of qualitative and quantitative requirements depend on the ability to provide comparable supervisory outcomes and having sufficient flexibility to work across jurisdictions. So we believe that a successful ComFrame would benefit IAIGs and allow companies to react appropriately within legal entities and then across the group. And in achieving those objectives, we must continue to look through an outcomes-based lens. ComFrame requires IAIGs to perform the group ORSA, and the IAIS must explore how the ORSA can enhance the value of ICS. Through ORSA, the maturity of the group's enterprise risk management structure and the tolerance for taking and mitigating risk should be a consideration when assessing capital requirements. The maturity of a group's capital model is also a consideration. And the qualitative requirement should describe the supervisor's role. And for example, how will the supervisor handle a breach of an ICS or a potential breach of an ICS? ComFrame requires IAIGs to perform robust enterprise risk management framework. And one benefit of expanding the role of risk management is to reduce the prescriptive nature of ICS. Qualitative requirements tend to have more flexibility than quantitative requirements. And the IAIS should explore expanding the role of qualitative requirements in the capital resources and ICS components. The goal of ICS is to provide greater convergence, but we need to consider the ComFrame areas that would benefit from greater convergence, such as more comparability of the ORSA across jurisdictions, which is something I hear from companies on a regular basis.
Thank you, Kate. Frank?
Yeah, first let me make a point to how is it called, OAG? The own guardrails, own assets with the guardrails. I appreciate very much. Guardrails are important, but such an approach would mean that we still have kind of comparability between companies. And so far, I think the guardrails have to be monitored very closely. And so far, I'm very interested about the outcome of the field test we are now doing. And I think, Hugh, when you were referring to it, that seems to need a certain supervisory approach to supervise the guardrails. And then I was thinking here in my seat here, is it still far away to internal models? I don't know. But coming back to your question, Vicky, I think success of the ComFrame, first of all, I think it would be successful, and I think that's what we are striving at, is that we have a kind of greater convergence in our global supervisory community, not to say a level playing field. I think that is the ultimate goal. And second, I would like to make some points. ICS in ComFrame has to cover the relevant risks, the most important relevant risk in our industry. It should enhance cooperation of supervisors, better understanding of supervisors all over the world. I think that we are there doing pretty well in the colleges yet, but obviously that has to be improved. And third, I think it's very important what you already said, the link between enterprise risk management, OSA, the qualitative and the quantitative side of, as we call it in Solvency II, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I think it's very important.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to the audience for a couple of questions before going into the second part with the panelists. Who wants to ask a question to any of us? Okay, no questions. I mean, just on the first part.
Disappointing, isn't it?
It is a little bit disappointing because we are trying to have a dialogue, but perhaps people are,
Okay,
are warming up.
We will encourage them.
We will encourage them. Just I mean, there is the general question of how much, when we supervise international groups, of how much weight we give to the quantitative requirements, which in itself, given the nature of our industry, as Toshi said, will involve, and Martin said, will involve an element of qualitative judgment in order to come up with the numbers, and how much emphasis we give on OSAs as part of enterprise risk management and the other elements, governance. I think the answer in reality, when you're sitting on my seat and you look at how we actually supervise international groups, we have some, as you know, in the United Kingdom, is that we give emphasis on both. But the lack, from my perspective at least, and from a supervision perspective, of a common language with different accents, perhaps, on the quantitative side, does make the job of the group supervisor of an international group that has entities across the globe harder. And one response, particularly if these entities are significant to this harder job, is to require many more qualitative requirements, require many more put together requirements, for example, to reduce interconnectivity between the group, the legal entity within your group that doesn't have a common language with the rest, and the groups and the legal entities within your own country, which are qualitative in some sense, but there are additional requirements. So as a matter of practice, as a supervisor, if I can add my own view, I think both are important, but the lack of, if you want, this numeraire with different accents is particularly important. The second point that I need to say, and it was also mentioned by some of the panelists, is that on the quantitative side, what is the most important element that prevents this common language is essentially the way you discount liabilities. And that is why the discounting options, including own assets with guardrails, are so important as part of the development of ICS and field testing. Now, turning to the second part, it's quite clear, and we've been having quite a bit of discussion on this starting already from earlier on this week, because we will discuss a bit more of that during the EXCO dialogue. But as I think Paolo mentioned earlier today, Paolo Codoni, we are now sort of crossed one milestone with ICS version 1 for extended field testing, but we need to decide what is precisely our next milestone with ICS version 2.0 and ComFrame within it as we go towards the ultimate journey. And we need to have a vision for that. We have set out the broad brushes of our vision earlier on under the leadership of Felix Hufeld, actually, when we published the ultimate goal and ICS version 2.0 and ICS version 1.0. Now these broad brushes need to be filled in a little bit more to create a painting. So that is what we have just started doing, and we have set up, as Paolo said, this steering task force just on the ICS of EXCO members. We had a first very sort of introductory meeting on Monday of this task force to help us steer EXCO and provide advice to this journey. So with that, I'll turn to the gentleman on my left to ask them what their vision is of the journey after this milestone. And I'll start with Toshi.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. Again, going back to the issue of how to strike the balance between the two, quantitative and the qualitative aspect of the regime. And again, to accomplish the intent of all the parties in this room, ICS should be used as a communication tool between the regulators and the players in the field. And in that respect, I believe that supervisory college is going to be more important than ever. In fact, Deutsche Life Group has experienced the colleges twice, and in my feeling, it was very constructive, interactive, and I'm so happy and satisfied with the regime. And going forward, implementation hasn't its goal, actually. At 2019, that's not a goal at all. And even after beyond 2019, like 2025, still we believe there should be some updates. There are emerging risks, including cyber attacks. We already see that, and also the disruptive innovation like fintech or insurtech. That's a kind of a qualitative approach. But even in the quantitative aspect, there should be emerging risk, and that should be implemented. So, we have to always build in the mechanism of improvement or revision in this ComFrame. And also supporting that is the interactive dialogue between the parties and the supervisors. So to reiterate, having that kind of interactive mechanism to be built in, I believe that's the assumption already shared by the parties. And also in that interactive dialogue, we should be very aware that, especially I'm talking about the life business, I'm sorry about that, I'm not familiar with the non-life. Life business is so local in its nature, and the business is so diverse, and the phase of development is totally different. We have 6 group companies in the, probably 4 or 5 companies in the developing countries. And the common concept, of example, internal control, risk management, ERM, those are very common. They understand. However, the comprehensiveness or the depth of covering those areas is quite different. And we need time, we need plenty of time to educate or share what the practices are in the developed countries, and to share or pursue the best practices that we should have in the group. And that argument is quite the same between the supervisors and players. Unless those situations are shared by the parties, it's going to be a chaos. And in fact, in my experience, a supervisory college that we have experienced, well, it was a very good opportunity for us to share. From the business perspective, we can give them the information, and from the supervisors, they can show us concerns about those emerging risks and how to widespread the best practices throughout the group. So that one thing is, again, interactive communications. There's no goal to that. And also the consideration of the localness of the IAIGs. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Toshi. Martin, do you want to come in?
Yeah, perhaps just some, and I agree with everything that Toshi just said. Perhaps just some observations generally on vision and the way forward. I think first of all, it's useful to, I think it's absolutely essential to have milestones like, you know, what we're doing in 2018, what we're doing in 2019. I think though, for the framework to be successful, there has to be, as Toshi said, room for further innovation, because we'll have new events and experiences. There'll be evolution in methodologies, in business models. And I think we have to, I think cross-sectoral analysis with the banking sector is helpful here, because, you know, they've basically been at the Basel process for 30 years, more or less continuously, and they didn't have these fundamental valuation issues to solve. So I think that as a paradigm, I think we necessarily need to look beyond 2019 for further evolution and an evolutionary implementation. I think also just, Vicky, picking up on a point you were talking about earlier, I think that if we kind of put aside how to think about what the legal pathway to implementation of a standard is, I think the way I would think about a successful implementation is whether or not the ICS and ComFrame ultimately gives credibility for our group to our jurisdictional supervisors. I think our jurisdictional supervisors become a critical audience in this process. And if what we wind up with is a standard that's tangible enough where there's an increase in confidence at the entity level around group-wide risks and the interaction between the two, then I think we've done something very positive for the industry and for the safety of the industry and for the competitiveness of the industry. And I think just a third observation in terms of vision, and not to preempt the discussion this afternoon on the activities-based approach to systemic risk, but I think there could be valuable opportunities to look at all of the micro-prudential tools that are being developed through ComFrame and how those ultimately can also help to address systemic risk as well. I think, you know, the distinction that's made often between micro-prudential and macro-prudential regulation, I think it's a very valuable distinction conceptually. When it comes down to it, though, I think an effective micro-prudential regulatory framework like ComFrame, if it gives comfort to policyholders, if it gives comfort to investors, to debt investors, to equity investors, so that if there is some disturbance in the market, they stay put, then I think those micro-prudential tools can actually go a long way to thinking about systemic risk across the sector. So I think those are sort of three themes I would say around what I would view as the vision beyond 2019 and the opportunities to focus on.
Thank you very much, Martin. And I have to say, just as a personal comment, that I don't know later on when we turn to my ExCo colleagues, but I think the way you articulate that what success would be of an ICS from your perspective is actually chimes very well with my personal views. I think you said increasing confidence of our jurisdictional supervisor at the legal entity level for the approaches we take at the group level. And I think this will be a great benefit to the firm, yes, to global firms that want to operate globally across continents that currently have very different regimes, for very good reasons historically, but then it does create these frictions amongst jurisdictional supervisors, the supervisor, but also to some degree also the market participants, the investors, ultimately the rating agencies, who can have a broader view of what capital adequacy within an ICS standard, for example, is. So I think you actually hit the nail on its head there. So, Hugh, what is your vision for implementation of ComFrame?
I suppose another way of looking at that is what would good look like. It's another way of looking at that as an answer. I mean, I think if we come back to the original objectives of ICS, it's about comparability of outcomes across jurisdictions. So clearly, increasing that confidence amongst the supervisors in terms of a commonality of approach and understanding, particularly for the large cross-border groups, is important. I think there's another important element about reinforcing sound and good risk management. That clearly has to be an important an outcome. And then you also need to think about the financial stability and the policyholder protection, which are the ultimate two objectives. And I think in that context I think we shouldn't underestimate the benefit that we've already received to date by the process. Paolo related to it earlier, but I think regardless of where we get to on ICS, clearly the dialogue and that understanding, I think there's been an exponential knowledge of companies' existing mechanisms, of the different regimes across the world. So I think we're starting to see the benefits of that regardless in terms of that greater level of understanding. I think the challenge is for the IAIS is to achieve an ICS that does kind of like three things. I think one is it needs to be global. And we'll come back to that in a minute. The second one, it needs to be, from my perspective, reflect the business and the risks within the entities with which the groups it's trying to cover. And the third one is it needs to be implementable. You know, so I mean, those are three headlines. But I mean, if we come back to the global one, I think we all know what the elephant of the room on the global part. I mean, so the nut to crack is clearly the valuation challenge. Which is basically linked, to my mind, to partly the pro-cyclicality concerns, and also, which I think, and partly in terms of objectives, is linked to the financial stability, that we're not creating false noise. And I think the juxtapositions have become quite characterised. So you get the classic, you know, Europeans looking across to the US and saying, well, it doesn't move very much. Others looking at the European says, well, it moves far, far too much and is far too volatile. And then you get quite rightly, I think, Deutsche, in the Asian markets, well, how does this work, as Paolo said, in a growing market in Asia? And how does it work in certain specific economic environments, such as you've experienced in Japan on the low interest rates? I mean, it's just an observation, and I'm going to say it because you'd expect me to anyway. I mean, the only global groups that have really looked at that in terms of, that represent North America, Asia, Europe, and China, and Japan in that, as well as AI, has been that OAG, and it's trying to get to that convergent point. However we need to get to some solution that gets greater comparability in the valuation basis, but without leading to undue volatility. And in my mind, that means we need to get something that converges between the MAV and the GAP Plus approaches in some respects. But really, the issue about the GAP and the MAV, GAP Plus, is about how volatile the thing is. That's why people are beholden on that, is because effectively that we don't want something that's going to create lots of noise. Now, the reason why we don't want it, which from my perspective, is because ultimately we need something that reflects the long-term nature of our insurance business. And effectively, we're not subject to short-term noise. I mean, the issue is what's the long-term noise? Because otherwise we're going to create a mechanism that is divorced from how we're running our business, and it's basically going to incentivize things that probably aren't sensible in any global regulatory approach. So I think the valuation challenge to me, I mean, obviously, clearly we're very pro the OAG because we think it links to the ALM. But then that comes on to my second point, which is about linking to how companies manage their risks. If it's not embedded in companies' ALM and our approach, the worst scenario outcome from an ICS is one that's divorced by how, on a day-to-day basis, management are managing the business. Because what you don't want to have is a basis that we're just producing purely for regulatory reporting quantitative purposes that is disconnected to how we're managing our business on a day-to-day basis. Now, as Frank's kind of pointed out, that does put a bit of a challenge on an onus on the supervisors, but effectively, ICS is applicable to about 50 companies, which is about probably 18 to 20 global supervisors in terms of leads. So it's not beyond the wit of man to basically try and crack that. And it may just be the fact that we need to look at that, because I have a real concern if we're divorcing our ALM and our own risk management from whatever valuation basis. And we've seen that in certain jurisdictions, that you can have a design feature that you think at the time is quite good, but maybe doesn't work in the way in which you have. So, and it's not just about valuation and discount rate, but we've seen it in a European context on the risk margin, which is very similar to the MOCHE, we had the Bank of England Financial Stability saying, oh, this is quite pro-cyclical in nature. So what you need to do is to make certain you haven't built in design features into ICS that are actually counterproductive or actually unhelpful from a financial stability perspective as well. So I think rooting it into how we manage our business and our risk management is really important, because then I come to my second point, which is coming back to the crux of Frank's point about what is comparability. Is comparability that we all do everything in a standardized way in a standard machine using the same discount rate? Or is comparability that you have a common approach to reflect the actual risks that each group is running? I would kind of like put forward it's the latter, which is why, for our perspective, a standardized approach to risks on longevity doesn't make so much sense for us, because we think what's important is the risks that we're facing as our company in our diversified portfolio with our policy holders. So that's why we would, for example, be far more focusing on an internal model approach, because we think actually getting comparable outcomes where every entity or every group is assessing the risk they face is more challenging from a supervisory perspective, but actually integrates with how we're looking at our business, but also avoids kind of like developing a blunt tool where just because you're making everybody do it the same way, in a standardized way, using the same discount rate, can give you this veneer of being more comparable, but is it actually useful from a group supervisory perspective? Well, surely the major issue is to have a sense of how a particular company's risks are being managed and getting capital requirements that are relevant to that business. So I think that's one of the key challenges about getting something that's focused on a comparability outcomes in terms of the companies you're supervising. I think the final element is something that's implementable. And I think implementability also means something that I see that the IAIS is capable of actually calculating and doing. We've seen it in the European regime. If you come up with a very technical regime and you've got to be asked to do a discount rate, even across in the UK, that has been an enormous exercise for the European regulators and IOPAs to do. If you put that on a global scale and trying to work out diversification risks by currency, you could create an enormous, and I don't know whether IAS is set up to do that. So something that is clearly implementable, which is why we would think an own approach or a company approach is implementable because we're doing it. Otherwise, you're going to have to create an enormous substructure in order to give you your discount rates to do this and to do that on a constant basis. Now, it's okay while we're doing it currently in a field testing format, because you've got a lot of sub-working groups and an enormous amount of effort going on from the regulatory side to look at certain areas on certain risks. That's got to be replicable on an ongoing basis if you're going to have an implementable ICS. If it's not, then I think you're going to have a real challenge.
Thank you very much, Hugh. A lot of sort of food for thought and a passionate, I should say, advocacy for own assets with guardrails. So turning now to Frank, what is your vision of ICS and ComFrame as we look forward?
Yeah. May I come back to what Hugh just said? I'm thinking about implementation. I'm wondering, is implementation being, in the first place, part of the legal framework of each and every country? Or is it just, at least at the first step, a more convergent way to discuss with groups and within the supervisory community? And the answer on that question, I do not have the answer yet, but I think it's worthwhile to discuss that. And the answer on that question will help us a lot to overcome a lot of problems with the elephants in the room. You mentioned two. I think there are two elephants in the room, or at least two. You mentioned two. You mentioned the valuation and the internal models. And I think the answer on these elephants in the room can be very much influenced by the answer on this question of implementation. But that was perhaps a rather general and first remark. I think personally we have to deliver, because Martin, you mentioned this micro issue. I think to get rid of a clear answer on the macro question, which is not coming from ourselves, but coming from the FSB and of people who think banking is the same like insurance and so on, which is not true. And we insurance people get rid of this question only if we come really up with a convincing micro question, and that we can demonstrate that this micro approach will give an answer, a sufficient answer for macro issues. And the answer for me would be there a very clear ICS 2.0 as convergent as possible. And having answered this implementation issue, I think we should be very, ambitious to come to a joint valuation and a method. And perhaps it's really worthwhile to discuss that a little bit further. And last point, as I just mentioned, as being part of a couple of colleges in our authority, I think we are doing quite reasonably. And I think this that you mentioned first, the discussions about ComFrame help really, and ICS help really to understand each other and but the next step has to be a pure or clear quantitative measurement, because then you will really be able to understand each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Katie?
So, I think I agree with much of what Frank said. I think where we might differ a little bit is on the necessarily prescriptive nature of ICS and how we can come to something that's implementable across jurisdictions. And a key component of that is clear and open communications between regulators and supervisors to really understand, particularly, the jurisdictional or host supervisor understanding what how the group-wide supervisor views the group, what they're concerned about, how that affects the legal entities in the host jurisdiction, and making sure that we are really communicating, being frank with each other, understanding the differences in our systems, and figuring out how we can work together to work through those so we have something comparable at the end. I think supervisory colleges, I had the opportunity to work for a company and go through the supervisory college process for a couple of years on the company, and then coming to work as a regulator. We're all getting better. The companies are getting better at explaining, what their business issues are, what the risks that they're facing, their corporate governance, their other factors, and regulators are getting better at communicating. Connecticut's fortunate to participate in about 15 colleges. And so we see, all kinds of different types of companies. We deal with, many of our colleagues across the world and across the United States. And it was sort of, when we started out, we were all trying to figure it out, but each year we get better and better. And I think that's an important part of, how we move forward. And can we get to a common language so that we all we can communicate better with each other and analyze these companies in a way that's meaningful for policyholders, shareholders, and others.
Thank you very much, Katie. So that kind of brings us to the planned end of the second part. I think before I sort of hand over to the audience for questions to us, we can continue debating ourselves. I think some common themes are coming out here. I think there is agreement that the journey towards across the two parts, but please kind of interrupt me if I'm not right, or raise your hand if you disagree with my reading of the discussion, is that the approach to the ultimate goal needs to be evolutionary. But since we launched this project back in 2012, 2013 with ICS. We have been making small steps that have led to ICS version 1.0 for extended field testing decision yesterday. But these small steps have already delivered benefits. We are now not closely to the full set of identified internationally active insurance groups participating in the exercise. We don't have the full set, but we're close to the full set. As Hugh said, there are about 50 companies, 55 companies around the world that have been identified as internationally active insurance groups. The numbers change every year, but most of them now are part of a journey, and they're learning a lot from each other. So I think that's one sort of consensus point. I think the second consensus point is that for global groups that operate across jurisdictions that currently have a very different quantitative and qualitative approaches, but particularly quantitative approaches, communication within supervisory colleges that are already delivering but are not yet quite there could be significantly improved if we can get to quantitative and qualitative, but as Frank said, quantitative is particularly important, common ways of communicating and understanding each other's capital adequacy numbers, sort of a common language to understand quantitatively the figures appears to be a sort of another point of consensus. I think where a third point of consensus is that valuation, if you are aiming for a quantitative measure, valuation, and I think I'm beginning to think that valuation might be a misnomer actually, the discounting approach to liabilities, because valuation on assets for most of our firms is pretty common anyway. Accounting provides that. Discounting of liabilities, the approach to discounting of liabilities is something that is clearly key to trying to achieve comparable quantitative outcomes. And then another issue is that is key is, to some extent, own assets with guardrails, which is an approach to discounting and is a subset of this issue, is the extent to which internal modeling, because essentially own assets with guardrails entails an internal modeling, but on the valuation side, not on the requirements on the tail risk side, is something that is a good idea or not. It's certainly, on the one hand, I think, sort of as Hugh said, but I think Toshi and Martin will also subscribe to the idea, that will bring you much closer to the way that the firms, our global firms, are trying to manage the risk, so you have parallels. On the other hand, it will put enormous burden to the enormous, that's my own adjective. It puts a lot of burden to the supervisor to actually ensure that these guardrails, either on the capital resources side or on the requirement side, are actually adequate and are not being gained. So I think that's kind of my potted summary of where we have consensus. And on these last 2 points, we're not yet there, but this is kind of, charts the journey that we have to take. So with that, may I turn to the audience? Bernie.
Hi, my name is Makoto Kubo, Nippon Life Insurance Company. So let me take a microphone. And so as I explained in the recent annual conference in Paraguay, I'm working in the APEC region to promote long-term investments of the insurance company. Especially the idea is to let the insurance sector to contribute to the long-term growth and development of the region. So when you implement the international standards, the most important point for that project is to allow the insurance company to have a long-term investments with growth potential. If you look at the very, like a snapshot, kind of requirements, so you assume that all assumptions would remain for the same for the next 40 and 50 years, and you neglect the growth opportunities. So then that will penalize the long-term investments with growth potential as a risky activities. So this is the challenges that we are facing. So in order to illustrate my point, let me use analogy that I shared in the recent NAIS event. So 11 years ago, I attended the IAIS annual conference in Beijing. So after the conference, we went out to shopping because one of the NAIC staff members insisted that I have to buy a new suit to look better. And then what they did was they measured my shoulder and waist and every corner of my body to make sure that they create these suits which is perfectly and actually matched to my body at that time. It sounds like mark-to-market actuarial variation, isn't it? What about this suit now? It's gone. Shortly after, I was not able to wear the clothes because I have grown up. I mean quantitatively, not quality. So think about it. So even Mark has grown for the past 10 years. How you assume that there's no growth in the countries like Asia, which is growing with double digit every year? Is it probably not only bad for consumers and bringing the procyclicality to the system? Don't you think it is even risky for the insurance company, which needs to keep up with the economic growth? This is the kind of my comment. And when I said this in NAIC event, I got the reaction from Americans. Do you want one-size-fits-all clothing? I'm aware that some people prefer one-size-fits-all model, and I hate it, but think about it. Have you ever tried one-size-fits-all clothing? It's quite principle-based and flexible and capture all the differences and diversities of human body. So if you try to create one-size-fits-all ICS, that should be the terminology that you use. Stick to Uniqlo terminology of one-size-fits-all. That concludes my remark. And since this is a question, I'd like to hear your feedback on this remark. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to respond?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear that I'm not a great fan of one-size-fits-all. I think to my mind, I mean, I think that brings 2 points. I think it illustrates my concern about trying to do, everybody does everything in the same way, because I just don't think that's how we do it. So actually, to be honest, I think wearing our own clothes and having our own assessment is probably a better way of doing it than having something imposed upon us, effectively, in terms of a suit. The other challenge is I think what it, 2 points it raises. One is actually how these things react in stress and how they work over time. So it's just not a point in time. It's, I think, one of the key things that we should be looking at and need to extend more when we look at the various options that are currently on the table is how they respond over time to various stresses and whether you're getting true noise or not. Because I think that's this needs to be continually be working. It can't just be just a point in time. And I think the third element, I think from my perspective, we need to look, and this is why I think the qualitative guardrails are so important as well as the quantitative. If you have an overall framework where you're comfortable about what assets insurers should be investing in, then I think you should be using their assets, which would allow some flexibility about the type of assets that companies are using, which I think is important for 2 things. Firstly, we know in certain markets there is a challenge in order to basically get a yield which is relevant to basically meet policyholder needs. And we can't forget the importance of trying to meet the customer and policyholder needs in terms of how we choose to invest, but within a sensible prudential framework. I think the second element is that we want diversity of portfolios. of investment for our long-term nature. So I think that in different markets may suit different things. We know even within the European market there is a strong diversity between how different insurers are trying to match liabilities in different ways depending on the local types of products and also by the investment opportunities available. For example, we've said strongly that we would like to invest more in infrastructure. You don't want to find that you're disincentivizing what we think. The third element of that, which is important, is from a financial stability perspective. I think it makes a real sense. My real concern is if you go one size fits all, and it comes back to your point, Frank, about what is implementation. If it became the only standard and it was basically, it was done in a very rigid or reference portfolio or a way that basically made everyone invest in the same way, there is a danger that you create a great systemic risk where you don't have one. So you need to basically get that diversity of business, portfolios, products and investment type to, I think, provide a more flexible way moving forward that reflects the risk the way in which we're managing it. So that is not conducive to a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Anyone wants to pick up? Frank?
I'm still wondering whether we should buy a suit in one size which is covering or which is lasting for 50 years. I wouldn't like to do that or to have such a suit. But I think volatility is an issue. And speaking from our experience in Solvency II, we are not 100% happy with the way we are managing that, but at least we made a first step and we made our experiences, and I think everything is not ideal there, and I think one has to think about that. But on the other hand, I think just to ignore volatility, which is part of our world, that is not the right approach. I think we have to find the right balance between the one size fits all for a lifetime and a daily or yearly or quarterly too heavy volatility. I think that's the ambition. And I don't have an exact answer on that yet, but I think it's worthwhile to work on that.
I think just maybe to augment a point that both Frank and Hugh made on volatility and thinking about how the ICS performs under stress, which is really that's where the value is going to be. How will this framework add value in a stress environment? And so I think field testing has been a great exercise to solve a lot of issues. I think it's important that, especially on valuation, they've looked increasingly at the impact of stressed credit spreads. But I do think it's important not to hang, again, Vicky, going back to your point, the importance of valuation or liability discounting within the ICS. I think there's a risk in trying to hang these big fundamental decisions like, which of the three discounting options makes most sense on one field testing exercise. I think we really have to, I think that's going to be highly valuable, but I don't think it's going to be dispositive to getting to the right answer. And I think the right answer goes back a lot to how this performs under stress, which I think the field test will be helpful to that end, but I think we have to do sort of further analysis on the sidelines to really parse through that, and to Frank's point, get to a system where we have appropriate, meaningful risk information, which can be viewed as volatility if you're exposed to volatility, but at the same time, ensuring that you don't create synthetic volatility that's not appropriate for the firm and not appropriate for the system.
Thank you very much. Another question? Who? Sorry.
That's all right.
No, please, please do go ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't mean to preempt anything. I'm Morik Fullilove with Fullilove Consulting Group, and I think, Madam Chair, I just want to challenge your summary a little bit. I had hoped it might have reflected more of what I heard in answer to the first part of the panel, which is that both sides are important, that we need the qualitative and the quantitative, because I do think people said that. And I think, in a way, that IAIS is in danger of doing what, if any, for those of you workaholics, any family therapist would say, where you really spend your time is what really is important to you. I think if both are important, and I certainly think we said that, then the IAIS and the Executive Committee should look very clearly at where the time and energy is going, because there are methods which can be used to make the ORSA more comparable, and to give people the confidence in that, to give people more confidence in internal model process. There are procedures which you can undertake, and you used to have a wonderful kind of supervisory college court, I've forgotten the name of the group, that, but that looked at how those mechanisms were working. So I would challenge the IAIS to not make what I think is the same mistake that started in Europe, spending so much time on the standard formula, in a sense, and so little time on how to make these other things understandable, robust, in a very concrete kind of way. I think that to me is what needs to be done in the next couple of years, and I'd appreciate any comments that the panel has on activities which could be undertaken to give that robustness, the same robustness and definition to the other parts of ComFrame that we're giving to the ICS.
Thanks, Morag.
Morag, I agree with you. I mean, and that was, in my introductory comments that, on the first question, I think it's really important that we challenge ourselves on the to look at the qualitative and how it fits into the quantitative. And, we had a recent example. We were at a meeting and a company was talking about an ORSA. They had, done their group-wide ORSA. They had given it to their group-wide supervisor, and they have 7 other jurisdictions who asked for it just a little bit differently. We need to do a better job. That's labor intensive for the company. It's labor intensive for the regulators, and some of it is giving the same information they've given to the regulator, just in a different format. We need to really challenge ourselves, as we go through standards around corporate governance, risk management, to do those things. But there is the piece of the quantitative that is important, but it needs to be flexible enough to understand the differences within companies and within jurisdictions.
Frank, to you?
I think, yeah. I agree with Kate. I think it has to be flexible, but was that your point? Yeah. I was wondering what can we do to improve that process? Yeah, and that is your question in the college. What can we actually do? And I think, in my understanding, in the colleges, we try to do it quite reasonably. But what is really missing is a clear, let's say, a common language. And for that common language, I try to make my point, therefore we need an ICS as a common language, perhaps not as a legal implemented, in every jurisdiction implemented legal framework, but at least as a language. We need that. But without having such a language, we cannot do that in a college. We cannot create in a college such a common language.
I think I was just suggesting that there's a common language in the other areas too, which need to be developed. And that ICS can do that and is not really working on that aspect of it with the same intensity at the moment.
Okay. Morag, it's, if I may add, given that the comments are more directed to the regulatory community and EXCO, there's no question, and I tried to summarize the second part earlier rather than the first part, but there was no question that there's consensus that, and within EXCO, that in the actual practice of supervising global groups, you need to have both the qualitative elements and the quantitative elements. The quantitative element we call ICS, the qualitative element we call the rest of ComFrame. So we're doing both. And there's no question about that. There's also no question, and this is the point that Katie made, that for international groups, we need to craft the relevant ComFrame standard, which is around enterprise risk management, actually, in such a way as to enable us to have a common language in doing ORSAs, more so. There's no question about that either. The question you raised, and I want to be frank with you, is when we're actually doing our work, given that we all have limited resources, and I can tell you our membership also has limited resources to devote to this project, and so does the Secretariat of the IAIS, what do we need to prioritize as we're going forward that we have not yet delivered? And I think the discussions, and I can tell you that I got from EXCO, is that we are going to deliver both the qualitative elements of ComFrame and an ICS version 2.0, but the resources at the moment are going to be devoted more because the project is harder, is more difficult, remembering JFK and Paola's quote, to the quantitative standard as it is. That's one, because that's where the resources need to go. Secondly, until we have a more developed quantitative vision of the key elements of the quantitative standard, we cannot really revise fully some of the qualitative elements of the ComFrame, so that there is a project management rationale for that. So I think that's kind of where, that is my answer to your question. Yeah. I've got, sorry, Martin. No, please come in.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add one point on that too. I think that one of the other reasons why it makes more sense to spend relatively more time on the capital side of things and on the qualitative side of things is that even though the two are ultimately, I think, equally important in a lot of ways, I think the consequences of getting the capital side wrong, if it were binding, are much greater than a miscalibration on the qualitative side, because a miscalibration on the qualitative side would imply, some improvement in your practices or your standards. I think a miscalibration on the quantitative side, on the capital side, can have much more far-reaching and damaging distortions potentially.
Yeah. The only tangible example I'd say of where there's direct crossover, and we noticed it, is that when we were looking at the OAG as a global group, we were cognizant that actually on the quantitative side, maybe areas like principles for investment management, principles for ALM, there are some ones that were, if they were in place, it would be easier to point to. So there are some ones where there's some direct read across. I mean, for example, we operate under a regime that has like a Prudential person's principle, which actually gives you a lot of cover, gives you as a supervisor a lot of ability to interrogate and check about how managers' risks and investments are doing. If some of those were in place, it may take pressure off some of the points on the quantitative side that you have, because you're not going to put all your guardrails by saying you can't invest in that, this is your reinvestment rate, where we're still having ongoing debate because we don't think reinvestment rate is 10 basis points economically. So, but what you're forced to do is to put in some quantitative guardrails, because you can have less comfort on some of the qualitative principles that you have the ability to come in and supervise, and you're requiring us to operate under. So it may be worth looking at some of those, because I think those are where there's direct interaction, where I think they help on both the quantitative side and the qualitative side, and there's a direct read across.
No, yes.
Yes, thank you. This is Carlos Esquivias, is the head of life and pensions of the Spanish Insurers Association. I would like to raise two questions. One's more political, one's more technical. First of all, if you take a look on the last 2 or 3 years of the European experience with Solvency II, at the end, all the discussion was about the discounting of liabilities. At that moment, I think that everyone realized that figures could be very comparable if you discount with the Euro curve, for example. But of course, this would not have been reflecting the reality of your business, because especially if you have an ALM approach management. So at that moment, it was necessary to create the necessary adjustments to the risk-free curve to reflect the way in which you are managing your liabilities and your ALM. My question is, how do you assess the effects? Because at the end, you have to be very, I think, aware that when you introduce a regulation, this has a lot of effects in the offer of products and in the real economy. So how do you assess the effects of these when you are creating the ICS? the effects that can have on the offer of products and economy. Because I mean, at the moment in which all these issues of the adjustment were trying to be corrected in Solvency II, there was a moment in which the companies, or some companies, at least in our market, only sold protection and unit link. So they started not to sell any warranties. So I don't think that our role should be only to sell protection and unit link, in which all the risks are transferred to the client. Yeah. One of our main roles for centuries has been to provide warranties. So the system, the regulation has to allow you to provide those warranties with, of course, all the supervision measures to take care of this. And so my question is political. So how do you assess the effects of this regulation or these standards on the offer and on the effects on the real economy? And my second question is, at least in our market, the solution at the end was very based on the own asset that you have in your company. I mean, we have a regulation from 1998 which is promoting the ALM with very restrictive and restrictive and stringent regulation that it is taking care that you have the correct cash flow matching and that you can hold the assets to maturity. Sorry. So what I don't understand is, apart from the own asset with guardrails that you have, there is another option, that is the blended option with the top bucket, in which you have a lot of requirements that you have to comply, but at the end what I don't understand is the spread is not the spread of your own assets. It is an average spread from something that you don't have in your balance sheet. So I don't understand why this option has not taken into account the yield, the spread of your own asset. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Paolo. I was just about to.
Okay.
Find a friend.
I think you're asking a very technical question, but not necessarily, I'm not sure you're asking. These are questions more suitable for a field testing workshop than probably for a dialogue with senior experts. What is quite important to say is we are taking very seriously the issue of valuation and discounting. It's not the first year we are dealing with this issue. This is the fourth year. And since the first year, we started with something which adjusted the risk-free rate curve. And we adjusted in a very simple way, and that was reflected the stage of development, but we wanted to provide a signal to the industry that we were not intending in whatsoever to discount by using a risk-free rate. Because we understand, we are insurance supervisors, we understand about the benefits provided by insurance firms and the long-term nature of insurance liabilities. And we understand that we need to separate signal from noise, and we need to identify the most appropriate method. We've been working on that for 4 years, it's not 1 year. Just to understand, so we need to put set things straight here. And one of the ways we are also doing that, we are also assessing the impact of different options under stress testing. We perfectly understand that a suit today, or actually a suit a month ago, would not fit me anymore. That your body can move, but we have you need to devise something flexible. One size fits all in my language is you got what you got and you cannot change it later on. So I agree, it has to be flexible. The adjustment and the design of the adjustment is taking a bit of time. We started last year with 6 options, which not necessarily were the option, but contain design elements aimed to gauge information to refine and come out with different things.
Paolo, do you have, I'm conscious of the time and the fact that we have.
But there is a trade-off between simplicity, simplicity, risk sensitivity, and ability to supervise firms. And I think we are supervisors, we need to reconcile everything, recognizing that actually we don't want the insurance industry to be killed, but we need to have a trade-off, strike the right balance between the different elements.
Thank you. Frank, you wanted to briefly answer that.
Briefly, just I think we have to accept that we in Solvency II have these issues around the long-term character of the business. that's true, and that discussion is going on for a long time. And that is the background of my point I made a couple of minutes before. We shouldn't go into that trap, and that is related to the implementation question. For a kind of language, common understanding, I think the hurdle is not so high. I agree with that. We couldn't afford that discussion that we are discussing about the long-term investment character of life insurance in every market, in every continent, and so on. That would hinder us to come to a conclusion. But I think it's very much connected what we really want to achieve and what does mean implementing. If we are just discussing about a common language, I think we should be much more relaxed on that issue. And then let's solve that in Europe for Solvency II. There we have sufficient work.
Yeah.
Callum Tanner with Insurance CRM. I just wanted to clarify on one point, and it relates to what was discussed with in regards to own assets with guardrails. So I think the point was made that own asset with guardrail, if that's adopted, it would require a firm to have an internal model. Is that point correct to begin with? And if it is, does that mean that the standard formula, or a standard formula, I should say, that there won't be a choice there? It will have to be an internal modelling approach if the OAG is adopted.
The easy answer to that is no. Effectively, what it's talking about is when you're looking at what's credit spread to put to adjust to the curve for. I think what Vicky was trying to say, and I think the misnomer of internal models is used lots of places, because the idea that people do or don't use internal models, let's face it, most of our balance sheet is an internal model. So actually we're using judgment and predicting cash flows all over the place. I think you have to think about where you're using internal model. I think that for us, on an OAG, it's basically you can actually calculate what your own expected spread is, because you're not subject to having to sell the asset because you're holding it for long term. You expect to earn that, and you don't expect to actually liquidate, and therefore that is the adjustment you would make. That doesn't require an internal model in the traditional sense, because I can absolutely quote you companies that are on a standard formula who basically are using, a matching adjustment, for example. So you don't need to do that. I think internal model in the context of the ICS discussion has been articulated more in terms of how do you define what the capital requirements for on the capital requirements side, and in there, that's where you get some different views. So when I use internal model, I would use it more in terms of a concept where we're looking at our risks and assessing our risks in those characteristics, and therefore we think that what the capital requirement is are based on the risks and the exposures we expect to basically find. I would completely separate that from anything in terms of the OAG and calculating an expected credit spread on our own assets.
Yeah, I agree. Internal models normally do not refer to valuation type of issues, capital resources type of issues. They mainly refer to the way that, whether you're allowed to use them as capital requirements. That's the usual regulatory terminology. But essentially, a valuation method that allows a firm to use its own assets and to calculate its own expected credit spread and to use that as part of the discount rate is an own modeled valuation approach. It doesn't require a very complicated model, but in that sense, we were using the term more broadly.
And it needs more supervisory care, so to say, and that is the reason for me to comparing it with internal models.
And that is the main thing. It requires a lot of supervisory resource and care, which is common across the two. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jeff Alton from CNA. And so conceptually, I agree with the comments from the panel, the benefits of the ICS. From a practical standpoint, makes all the sense in the world. But the devil's in the details. And so we've been in this process. I know Paolo said 4 years of field testing, but conservatively, we've been working on the ICS for at least 72 months. And back then, I think both myself and a lot of other people highlighted the elephant in the room, which I think is more than just one elephant, but I guess I will be, and I'm a dramatic person, is a herd. What we've got here is we have valuation, and so you've got, as you've made reference to, the discounting. But it's also more than discounting, right? You have risk transfer requirements, which are different jurisdiction to jurisdiction. That needs to be addressed, and I know there's been a new paper that came out that discussed it, but more work needs to be done if you want true comparability. You also have the fungibility issue, which we raised 5 years ago, that still is yet to be discussed. And then you have got the capital adequacy, which for the non-life insurers is a very major issue, which I know is going to be discussed. And so, as I made reference, we've been working on this for 72 months, and the major issues that were in place 72 months ago are still there. I think it was advertised, and I could still see up on the board, Mount Fuji, that we were going to develop a very simple formula to be implemented, which I think, by all intents and purposes, we do not have a simple formula today, but still have the elephants in the room. So the question that I have for the panelists is, what probability do you give over the next 28 months, because that's really what we have. We've been working on this for 72 months, haven't removed the elephants, and we have 28 months now to remove the elephants. Will we be successful, or will we be successful developing a standard formula that is consistently implemented worldwide and achieves comparability within 28 months?
Thank you. It depends on your vision. We will be successful in implementing and delivering the vision as we define the different milestones and in achieving consensus. I mean, I can get into the details. So we are going to solve those elephants in the room that we are going to prioritize, taking into account your feedback.
Peter Duran from AIA. I'd like to explore a little bit, Vicky and Frank, your assertions that an own assets approach, or the OAG in particular, would require more work, essentially, on the part of the supervisor. It seems to me there's two potential aspects to that. One is auditing it to see that a company actually did what it was supposed to do under the methodology. On that one, speaking as an ex-auditor, which I did for 20 years, I think it's quite a bit more auditable than many other approaches, certainly than IFRS, because it's quite prescriptive. So I'm not sure if that's the concern, or the concern is that somehow, because the discount rate is based on the company's own assets, essentially, that you have to understand better the company's ALM methodologies and procedures, and specifically, what would you have to understand, or what additional work would you have to do that you don't already, that you shouldn't already be doing?
I mean, a very specific concern in terms of your question is that if you build up a system whereby you allow the discounting of liabilities to depend on the spread that you earn on your own assets backing those liabilities, you're providing a double whammy incentive to firms to risk up. Because this way, they are going to be able to earn more spread on the assets and reduce the liabilities and the capital resources further. Now, that double whammy, of course, can be managed in the same through asset liability, but you have built into your system, into your regulatory approach, a risking up incentive. So why is the supervisory burden? Because in a qualitative way, you have to ensure that actually this is not exploited and the incentive you have created is not gained. And that can only be done through very, very careful supervision, through understanding very carefully and granularly what firms do, what their investment policies, through having a very interventionist, actually, supervisory approach.
Okay, I think that's very understandable. That is the basis and the reason that we've built in some of the guardrails that we have.
Yeah.
But I do take your point there. So the methodology itself tries to address that specific point.
No, and that's why you call it guardrails, because and that is the trade-off. But actually implementing the guardrails by supervisory practices does become much more resource intensive from our side. Thank you very, very much, and for the dialogue and for the challenging questions. And thanks very much to the panelists. Thank you all. Lunch.
So thank you. Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much. Just a housekeeping announcement. So first of all, this was excellent discussion, dialogue. Thank you, everybody. Particularly, dialogue is seeking a greater truth by thinking together. And I really feel that there's an excellent panel, that we have a real dialogue. Just one bottom line, what we have discussed, it's much, much better than what we discussed a few years ago. As Vicky mentioned, we are very much strongly committed to deliver version 2 2019. And this panel focused the bottom line discussion. Higher priority is common language in qualitative or quantitative capital part, and further truths that we found, its discounting issue is critically important, and what is we debate very much is how do we make regulation comparable, taking into account each company's risk profile. So excellent panel, thank you very much. So lunch will be served at the breakfast restaurant, not vis-a-vis this room, but sweet and coffee will be served in front of this room. So first, please go to the lunch or for the breakfast room. And if you want to have sweet and coffee, please come back to the room just in front of us. And the next session will start 1:30. So please come back 1:30. Thank you.